History often records great military triumphs in golden letters, but rarely pauses in the sepulchral silence that follows the battle. After defeating the coalition of the four kings of the East in an unprecedented tactical maneuver, Abram does not find himself celebrating. He is trapped in a legal and existential crossroads that the laws of the second millennium BC dictated with implacable severity. For a patriarch in the ancient Fertile Crescent, a victory on the battlefield without an heir in the tent was only a prelude to historical oblivion. According to archaeological evidence from the Nutsi tablets and the legal customs of Mesopotamia, the lack of a biological son forced the transfer of the entire estate and legacy to a domestic administrator, in this case, Eliezer of Damascus. Abram, the man who altered the geopolitics of his time, now faces a crisis that no sword can resolve: the technical reality that his name is about to dissolve into the sands of time. However, in this precise moment of human vulnerability, where the logic of succession seems to have reached a dead end, the sovereign is about to reveal a design that transcends the chronology of men. We are about to analyze the moment when the Creator's will intervenes in ancient civil law to transform an inheritance crisis into the foundation of an eternal redemption. In this analysis, we will not limit ourselves to reading an ancient account. We will decode the anatomy of a promise that defied the jurisprudence of its time. The objective of this study is to unravel why Abram's fear was not a mere emotional weakness, but a logical conclusion based on the succession laws of Mesopotamia. By understanding the legal weight of his uncertainty, we will discover how the sovereign not only offers comfort, but rewrites human destiny through a covenant that transcends biology and chronology. The viewer will gain a technical and theological perspective on how the divine will use his inheritance crises to establish the legal foundation of redemption. To navigate this crucial moment in patriarchal history, we will follow a roadmap structured around three fundamental axes. We will investigate the legal function of Eliezer of Damascus under the framework of the Nutsi tablets. We will analyze why, according to the logic of the 19th century BC, the lack of a biological heir automatically made the household administrator the legal beneficiary, effectively extinguishing Abram's lineage. We will observe the dialogue between human limitation, sterility, and old age, and the astronomical expansion proposed by the Creator. We will see how the Lord takes Abram out of the narrowness of his tent to show him a reality that his current legal context could not process. Finally, we will examine the moment when Abram believes the Lord. We will analyze this event not as a feeling, but as an act of trust in the character of the sovereign that results in a legal declaration of righteousness, setting the precedent for the entire design of salvation that will unfold in the centuries to come. To understand the magnitude of what occurs on the plains of Canaan, it is imperative to strip ourselves of our modern mentality and observe the rigor of Mesopotamian jurisprudence. From a historical perspective, we find ourselves in an era where lineage was not just a matter of affection, but the basis for the legal and spiritual survival of a clan. Archaeology, through findings in the Nutsi tablets, has revealed to us that in the absence of a biological son, the civil law of the time dictated that the primary servant of the house became the forced heir. This was the technical reality weighing on Abram's shoulders. His family name was about to dissolve into history. However, what unfolds in this chapter of Genesis is not simply a succession conflict. It is the unfolding of the sovereign plan that uses human limitation as a canvas for divine glory. Abram reasons according to the evidence of his eyes and the chronology of his aging body. His logic is impeccable. There is no son, therefore, the covenant has stalled. But the sovereign of time does not operate under the code of Hammurabi or the limitations of fallen biology. Here, the eternal will intervenes to elevate the conflict from a desert tent to the vastness of the cosmos. In this analysis, we will examine how the Creator takes the patriarch out of the narrowness of his legalistic logic to show him a reality that transcends his understanding. The promise of a progeny as numerous as the stars is not a poetic exaggeration, but a declaration of absolute sovereignty over impossibility. By asking Abram to count the stars, the Lord is redefining the concept of inheritance. It is no longer a transaction of earthly goods, but the establishment of a spiritual lineage that will culminate in the redemption of humanity. The climax of this phase is not just the promise of land or progeny, but the transformation of the relationship between the Creator and the creature. When Abram believes, an unprecedented legal theological event occurs, the imputation of righteousness. It is not a merit achieved, but a gift received through trust in the sovereign's character. This is the foundation upon which the entire architecture of salvation will be built, a moment where time stands still, so that eternity may declare righteous a man who, despite his doubts, decides to rest in the word of Him who calls things that are not as though they were. To understand the crisis Abram is going through at this point in biblical chronology, we must strip away any modern notion of inheritance. In the legal context of the ancient Near East, documented in records such as the Nutsi tablets, the lack of a biological heir was not just an emotional void, it was a legal catastrophe. Without a son, Abram's estate and identity were destined to be absorbed by a third party, in this case, Eliezer of Damascus. Historical evidence shows us that this was standard procedure, the adoption of a servant to ensure the continuity of the name. Abram reasons with the precision of a man who knows the laws of his time. His logic is empirical. Time has passed, his body has aged, and the promise seems to have been caught in the amber of biological impossibility. However, what happens next completely redefines the relationship between the Creator and humanity. The sovereign does not respond with a legalistic argument, but with a demonstration of his absolute dominion over creation. By taking Abram out of the confines of his tent, he is forcing him to look beyond the limitations of his own personal history. When the Lord commands him to count the stars, he is not using an empty poetic metaphor. In the language of the sovereign covenant, God is declaring that his plan is not subject to the laws of human inheritance or the decay of the flesh. Here we witness a theological turning point. Abram's faith meets the Creator's faithfulness. In this dialogue, the patriarch's uncertainty dissolves not because circumstances have changed, but because his trust has been transferred from visible evidence to the word of Him who sustains the cosmos. This moment marks the establishment of a fundamental principle in the architecture of salvation: imputed righteousness. It is not a merit that Abram earned through works or rituals, but a sovereign declaration based exclusively on his trust in the divine promise. The weight of uncertainty is transformed through the Lord's intervention into the solid foundation of a lineage that will not only populate the earth, but will change the course of eternity. The covenant that is about to be sealed with blood and fire is the guarantee that divine purpose never halts before the fragility of human logic. To understand the magnitude of Genesis 15, we must place Abram on the map of historical reality. We are approximately in the year 1900 BC. Chronologically, this moment follows Abram's military victory over the coalition of the four kings of the East, an event that, paradoxically, has left him in a state of psychological vulnerability and successional void. In the timeline of the sovereign plan, Abram finds himself in the narrow corridor between the promise given in Haran and the raw biological reality of his old age in Canaan. He is not a marble hero. He is a man of flesh and bone who measures the passing years with the precision of one who sees his own history running out without an heir. The protagonist of this account, Abram, embodies the tension between empirical logic and theological trust. His character at this point is defined by brutal honesty. According to the property and inheritance laws of the ancient Near East, documented in archaeological findings, the lack of offspring forced the patriarch to seek a legal substitute. His mention of Eliezer of Damascus is not a gesture of lack of faith, but a pragmatic response to the laws of his time. Abram appears here as the man who is obeyed, who has walked thousands of miles, but who still struggles to reconcile the sovereignty of God with the silence of his own home. His need is for evidence that transcends the law of men. Faced with Abram's fragility, the Lord presents himself not only as protector, but as the architect of a superior reality. In this encounter, the sovereign of the cosmos assumes the role of covenant initiator. He does not limit himself to giving words of comfort. He redefines Abram's identity. By taking the patriarch out of his tent, his zone of safety and human limitation, the Lord positions himself as the one who is not limited by the biological processes of the creation he himself sustains. The Lord's intervention in this phase of time is crucial. He interrupts the natural chronology of aging to insert an eternal promise that will change the course of nations. Finally, the character of Abram undergoes an internal transformation that archaeology cannot excavate, but that the history of salvation records as a fundamental pillar. By believing in the Lord, the patriarch ceases to be a nomad, seeking an heir to become the recipient of imputed righteousness. The chronology of his life aligns with the eternal plan. This is the turning point where human time, marked by uncertainty and decline, is absorbed by the unwavering faithfulness of the Creator. Abram no longer walks based on what he can see in his tents, but on what the Sovereign has written in the vastness of the sky. The covenant is thus established as a firm rock amidst the shifting sands of human history. The tension in Abram's heart is not a simple passing doubt. It is the conflict between the tangible evidence of his biology and the invisible word of his Creator. For a man formed in the culture of Mesopotamia, the lack of a biological heir was not just a personal tragedy, but a legal and spiritual void that threatened to erase his name from history. By questioning the Lord about Eliezer of Damascus, Abram is exposing the internal fracture that arises when the facts of the world, his old age and Sarai's sterility, seem to contradict the decrees of divine sovereignty. It is the struggle between chronos, the human time that runs out, and the eternal purpose that knows no limits. The spiritual conflict is resolved not through a logical explanation of biological mechanisms, but through an expansion of Abram's mental horizon. the Lord leads him outside the confines of his tent, a space limited by the laws of physics and culture, and invites him to look up. In the archaeology of faith, this moment marks the collapse of reasoning based on scarcity to make way for the logic of grace. The invitation to count the stars is not a poetic exercise. It is a lesson in theological cosmology. The sovereign who holds the constellations in their place is the same one who holds the promise of a son. Here, Abram's faith is forced to decide: is his reality defined by the silence of his tent or by the voice that commanded light into the chaos? Finally, the conflict culminates in an act of intellectual and spiritual surrender. The Bible records that Abram believed the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness. From a historical and theological perspective, this is an unprecedented milestone. Righteousness is not obtained through the fulfillment of a legal contract or a pagan ritual, but through absolute trust in the character of the sovereign. The weight of uncertainty is replaced by the firmness of the covenant. Abram stops struggling against the silence of his present to rest in the faithfulness of him who writes the future. The spiritual conflict does not disappear because circumstances change immediately, but because the man has found an anchor that is older and stronger than creation itself. To understand the magnitude of what is happening in this moment of history, we must step away from our contemporary sensibility and observe the legal context of the ancient Near East. Abram is not performing a simple religious ritual. He is setting the stage for a blood covenant, a common practice in Mesopotamian and Hittite cultures. In these treaties of sovereignty, the cutting of animals symbolized a radical self-curse. May the same happen to me as to these animals if I break the terms of this agreement. However, the silence of the wait is prolonged. The sun begins to set, and with it, a dense darkness and a deep fear fall upon the patriarch. It is the weight of human reality facing the magnitude of divine decrees. In this state of expanded consciousness, the sovereign reveals the detailed chronology of his plan. It is not a promise of immediate comfort, but a roadmap that passes through the crucible of history. The Lord foretells that his offspring will be strangers in a foreign land, suffering affliction for 400 years. From a historical perspective, this is the first mention of the captivity in Egypt, an event that would define the identity of the chosen people. Divine logic here is unbreakable. The delay in the delivery of the land is not a lack of power, but a respect for justice, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. The sovereign controls not only the destiny of Abram, but the flow of nations and the judgment of empires. We then reach the most transcendental turning point of the narrative. In a traditional covenant, both parties had to walk between the dead animals. But here, something occurs that breaks all archaeological and legal patterns of the era. Abram remains motionless. It is the Lord, in the form of a smoking firepot and a burning torch, who traverses the path of blood alone. In the theology of the covenant, this is an act of unconditional grace. The sovereign assumes upon himself all responsibility for fulfillment. He is committing himself to be the one who pays the price if the contract is broken. The weight of uncertainty that Abram carried is transferred entirely to the shoulders of the deity. The episode culminates with the definition of the territorial inheritance. The covenant is not an abstract idea. It has precise geographical coordinates from the Nile to the Euphrates, encompassing the lands of the Kenites, Perizzites, and Jebusites. Abram is no longer a nomad adrift, but the legal heir of a domain guaranteed by a sovereign oath. History teaches us that this moment redefines faith, not as a feeling, but as a trust based on a divine legal fact. The weight of uncertainty has been replaced by the certainty of the covenant. The man who questioned his future now rests in the word of him who holds the map of the centuries in his hands. Archaeology reveals to us that covenants in Abram's world were not simple verbal agreements, but binding contracts with life and death consequences. What we have analyzed today is not a myth, but the record of an event that changed the legal structure of the relationship between the Creator and humanity. Abram faced what many of us experience today, the silence of the weight, and the weight of a vision that does not seem to materialize in the chronological present. However, historical evidence forces us to look beyond immediate circumstances to observe the architecture of the sovereign plan. The Lord's logic is impeccable and deeply anchored in justice. The delay in delivering the promise was not an act of negligence, but a demonstration of his patience and control over the history of nations. Just as the judgment on the iniquity of the Amorites awaited the exact moment in the balance of divine justice, our own weights are often coordinated with a master design that transcends our limited temporal vision. Faith, in this context, is defined as rational trust in the character of him who signs the contract. It is not a volatile emotion, but a legal certainty based on faithfulness demonstrated throughout the ages. In reflecting on the path of blood that the Lord walked alone while Abram watched, we understand that the security of our future does not depend on our ability to stand firm, but on the responsibility the sovereign has assumed upon himself. He has taken the weight of uncertainty and transformed it into the certainty of an unconditional covenant. On the great map of existence, our lives are not isolated points, but integral parts of a narrative that began with a promise under the stars and is confirmed in the work of him who sustains the universe. We can rest in the evidence. The contract is sealed, the sovereign is faithful, and his historical plan continues its perfect course. Archaeology teaches us that the contract we witness in Genesis chapter 15 was not a poetic abstraction, but a rigorous legal structure. In the cultures of Mesopotamia and the Levant, the ritual of dividing animals was a severe legal warning. May the same happen to me as to these animals if I break this covenant. However, what breaks the logical pattern of the era is that only the sovereign passed through the path of blood while Abram remained in a deep sleep. In this act, the Creator exempts man from the responsibility of final fulfillment and assumes the totality of the guarantee upon himself. This historical evidence allows us to understand that our human uncertainty does not alter the validity of the divine document. The time elapsed between the promise and its execution, which to us often seems like a void or a silence, is actually a space of justice perfectly managed by the sovereign. The specific mention of the iniquity of the Amorites reveals that God is not just the protector of one family, but the judge of all the earth, coordinating the destinies of nations with a precision that exceeds our limited chronological vision. Faith, therefore, is not an emotional impulse, but the logical conclusion after observing the historical rigor and the immutable character of him who has pledged his very existence on his word. In the end, the weight of uncertainty that burdened Abram was transferred to the shoulders of him who sustains the universe. Our connection to this ancient event is profound. We do not depend on our ability to stand firm under pressure, but on the faithfulness of the sovereign who walked alone between the pieces of the sacrifice. History is not a chaos of random events, but a master design sealed with an unconditional commitment. We can inhabit the present with the serenity of one who knows that the contract has been signed by the highest authority and that the plan of redemption continues its perfect course toward the established goal. Archaeology teaches us that the contract we witness in Genesis chapter 15 was not a poetic abstraction, but a rigorous legal structure. In the cultures of Mesopotamia and the Levant, the ritual of dividing animals was a severe legal warning. The symbolic language dictated that whoever broke the covenant would suffer the same fate as the sacrificed animals. However, what breaks the logical pattern of the era is that only the sovereign passed through the path of blood while Abram remained in a deep sleep. In this act, the Creator exempts man from the responsibility of final fulfillment and assumes the totality of the guarantee upon himself. What for Abram was a source of anguish, for heaven was a commitment sealed with the very essence of divinity. This historical evidence allows us to understand that our human uncertainty does not alter the validity of the divine document. The time elapsed between the promise and its execution, which to us often seems like a void or a silence, is actually a space of justice perfectly managed by the sovereign. The specific mention of the iniquity of the Amorites reveals that God is not just the protector of one family, but the judge of all the earth, coordinating the destinies of nations with a precision that exceeds our limited chronological vision. The Lord Jesus is the culmination of this covenant. He is the one who finally walked toward the sacrifice to fulfill what was promised on that starry night. Faith, therefore, is not an emotional impulse, but the logical conclusion after observing the historical rigor and the immutable character of Him who has pledged His very existence on His word. In the end, the weight of uncertainty that burdened Abram was transferred to the shoulders of Him who sustains the universe. Our connection to this ancient event is profound. We do not depend on our ability to stand firm under pressure, but on the faithfulness of the sovereign who walked alone between the pieces of the sacrifice. History is not a chaos of random events, but a master design sealed with an unconditional commitment. We can inhabit the present with the serenity of one who knows that the contract has been signed by the highest authority, and that the plan of redemption continues its perfect course toward the established goal. The evidence is clear. If the sovereign has given his word, time is only the stage where his glory will inevitably manifest. The analysis of legal protocols from the 2nd millennium BC reveals a fascinating legal anomaly in this record of Genesis. In the sovereignty treaties of the time, it was customary for both parties to walk between the sacrificed animals, accepting that if they failed, their fate would be like that of those parted bodies. However, on the plain of Mamre, the sovereign altered the protocol forever. By passing alone as a torch of fire while Abram slept, God was not just promising a land, He was establishing the legal foundation of grace. This historical evidence allows us to understand that the fulfillment of the promise never depended on Abram's emotional stability, but on the legal rigor of a God who made Himself responsible for both sides of the contract. This event is the necessary prologue to understand the mission of Jesus Christ. He is the final resolution to the tension generated on that starry night. If the sovereign assumed the totality of the guarantee, it was because the master plan already contemplated that only a perfect sacrifice could satisfy the demands of justice that wounded humanity could not meet. Jesus walked toward the sacrifice not as a victim of circumstances, but as the eternal surety who came to validate the signature placed in Genesis 15. The weight of uncertainty that burdened the patriarch was transferred centuries later to the shoulders of him who held the wooden cross, closing the cycle of debt and opening access to the promised inheritance. Faith, therefore, should not be understood as a volatile feeling, but as the logical conclusion of observing the immutable character of history. We do not depend on our ability to navigate periods of silence or the 4 centuries of waiting, but on the proven faithfulness of the sovereign who has managed the destiny of nations with surgical precision. Our connection to this ancient covenant is total. In Jesus, we are the heirs of that night of stars. The contract has been executed, iniquity has been judged, and the inheritance has been secured. We can inhabit the present with the serenity of one who knows that history is not a chaos, but a sovereign design sealed with the blood of the testator. Time is simply the stage where the already decreed victory is manifested inevitably. The archaeology of our own lives often reveals layers of doubt similar to those Abram faced on the plain of Mamre. However, after analyzing the legal rigor of the Genesis 15 covenant, the logical conclusion is that uncertainty is not fought with fleeting enthusiasm, but with the meticulous observation of the historical evidence of the sovereign's faithfulness. The challenge presented to us is not an invitation to feel more, but to process reality through the lens of the master plan that has already been executed. The practical challenge for this stage consists of performing an audit of your own history. Identify that period of silence or that promise that seems to be under the weight of uncertainty. The exercise is not to ignore the conflict, but to document the clauses of your trust. Write down 3 concrete pieces of evidence where the sovereign has managed events in your past with surgical precision, even when the outlook seemed chaotic. Just as the archaeological record validates the truth of the biblical text, your own history contains markers of a providence that does not depend on your management, but on the signature of the surety. Remember that our security does not reside in the absence of questions, but in the identity of him who walked between the pieces of the sacrifice. When the weight of the weight becomes oppressive, return to the evidence of Calvary. There, the Lord Jesus not only fulfilled the law, but validated every promise made under the stars of Canaan. Your challenge is to inhabit the present with the serenity of a historian who already knows the outcome of the conflict. History has already been sealed. Your task is to walk with your head held high, recognizing that every star in the sky is a reminder of a contract that time cannot wear away and the death could not annul. Uncertainty dissolves when confronted with the rigor of the sovereign. The archaeology of our own lives often reveals layers of doubt, similar to those Abram faced on the plain of Mamre. However, after analyzing the legal rigor of the covenant in Genesis 15, the logical conclusion is that uncertainty is not fought with fleeting enthusiasm, but with the meticulous observation of the historical evidence of the sovereign's faithfulness. The challenge presented to us is not an invitation to feel more, but to process reality through the lens of the master plan that has already been executed with chronological precision. The practical challenge for this closing consists of performing an audit of your own history. Identify that period of silence or that promise that seems to be under the weight of uncertainty. The exercise is not to ignore the conflict, but to document the clauses of your trust. Write down 3 concrete pieces of evidence where the sovereign has managed events in your past with surgical precision, even when the outlook seemed chaotic. Just as the archaeological record validates the truth of the biblical text, your own history contains markers of a providence that does not depend on your management, but on the signature of the surety. Remember that our security does not reside in the absence of questions, but in the identity of Him who walked between the pieces of the sacrifice. When the weight of the weight becomes oppressive, return to the evidence of Calvary. There, the Lord Jesus not only fulfilled the law, but validated every promise made under the stars of Canaan. Your task is to inhabit the present with the serenity of a historian who already knows the outcome of the conflict. History has already been sealed. Walk with your head held high, recognizing that every star in the sky is a reminder of a contract that time cannot wear away and that death could not annul. Uncertainty dissolves when confronted with the rigor of the sovereign. Faith, analyzed from the rigor of chronology, is not a leap into the void, but a firm step on the solid ground of documented facts. To process the weight of uncertainty, I invite you to perform an audit of your own history. The exercise is not about ignoring the conflict, but about acting as a historian of your own life. Identify 3 markers of providence, moments where the sovereign managed events in your past with surgical precision, even when the outlook seemed chaotic. Just as the archaeological record validates the truth of the biblical text, your own biography contains evidence of a faithfulness that doesn't depend on your management, but on the signature of the surety. Our security does not reside in the absence of questions, but in the identity of Him who walked between the pieces of the sacrifice. When the weight of the weight becomes oppressive, return to the evidence of Calvary. There, the Lord Jesus not only fulfilled the law, but ratified every promise made under the stars of Canaan. Your task now is to inhabit the present with the serenity of a researcher who already knows the outcome of the conflict. History has already been sealed with legal and divine rigor. Walk with your head held high, recognizing that every star in the sky is a reminder of a contract that time cannot wear away and that death could not annul. Uncertainty dissolves when confronted with the rigor of the sovereign.